I want to welcome you to Maunday Thursday, Holy Thursday, Communion Thursday. It's called many different things. But it's the day that we commemorate the Lord's Last Supper, his Last Supper on earth around a real table with his real friends having a very real meal. He shared some amazing teachings around that table. And I want to reflect on a few of them briefly for you to meditate on during this Holy Week. It says this in the Gospel of John. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and that he was returning to God. And so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus, knowing where he'd come from and where he was going to, got up, took out his outer garments, wrapped a towel around him, which was the form of a servant, often a slave. And he started to wash the disciples' feet, a very humble, the most humble service he could give. It was what slaves would do for you when you came to their house and your feet were dusty from walking on the road and you had sandals on. They'd take your sandals off, they'd have a bowl. And it was the lowest slave or servant who did this menial and humble task. And so now you have the one who's the Son of God doing this most humble of tasks. And it's important to note that Judas Iscariot was there. Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. And yet he's there at that table. He's there getting his feet washed by the man he's about to betray a few hours later. That tells us something about the love of Christ. And at the end of the time, he gets back up and he puts his outer clothes back on. And he says this to the 12. He says, when he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and he returned to his place at the table and said, "Do you understand what I've done for you?" He asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your teacher and your Lord, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. For I tell you that a servant is not greater than his master. And now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." He said, I've done this as an example. You call me teacher, you call me Lord. And if I've done this for you, you should do this for one another. Not just literally wash one another's feet, although, I've wondered why we didn't make this a sacrament. In some traditions, it is a sacrament. But he said, I'm doing this to set an example that you serve one another, that you love one another, and not just the one another's that you're doing well with, because Judas was there. You see, the love of God is universal. It's unlimited. It's unconditional. It's irrevocable. It's inexorable. It just keeps coming at you. It almost doesn't matter if you're living up to it or not up to it. It's going to keep coming toward you. That's the way God is. God keeps coming toward us in love. And we're meant, as followers of Jesus, to keep coming toward one another in love. Even the one another's that we might not particularly enjoy that much or may have severe disagreements with. We're meant to be honed and cultivated in this universal, inexorable love. And we're meant to be living models on earth of what God has going on right now in heaven, which is inexorable, unlimited, unconditional love for all people at all times. So that's one thing we know from the Last Supper. The second thing I want to mention is, well, how would we be tutored or nurtured by this kind of love? And Jesus tells us how that happens. It's in chapter 15 at the same supper, by the way. Chapters 13 through 17 are his conversation with his disciples at the Last Supper, and that's the Gospel of John. In chapter 15, he says it's a very familiar passage. How do we become this loving from within the way Jesus was? And he tells us, I'm the true vine, he says, and my Father's the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You've already been pruned because of the word I've spoken to you. So remain in me, and I will also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. You see, what a tremendous insight that in order to have this love grow in us, we simply need to stay attached to the vine. Just stay attached. We're branches. We're not roots. We're not the trunk. We are the branch. And our only job is to stay connected to the vine, which is Jesus Christ himself. How do we do that? Well, at the very least, we surrender our hearts to him. We turn our lives over to him. As best we take all that we know of ourselves and we give it to all that we know of him. It may be that we know very little about ourselves, really. And it may be that we know very little of him, really. But what we do know of ourselves and what we do know of him, we surrender to him and we become grafted into that great vine of love. Stay attached to Jesus Christ. In fact, you don't have to try to force love, like a branch doesn't have to try to force the sap or force the fruit to come. It simply relaxes and stays attached. Remain in me. I will remain in you, and you will bear much fruit. Those two insights, and then the last one, which he repeats several times, by the way, in the discourse or in the conversation, would be a better way to put it. But I'm going to go back to chapter 13, verse 34, perhaps one of the most well-known verses. But if you pondered this verse, the rest of this Holy Week, you would find great encouragement and great insight, I believe. He says this, a new commandment I give to you. Love one another. A new commandment I give to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. You know, there's so many things people have said, this is what a follower of Jesus should do or think or be, and they shouldn't do these things, and they ought to do these other things, and they ought to study the Bible, and they ought to memorize Scripture, and they ought to share their faith, and they ought to do works of justice and mercy. Jesus says there's one mark of being my disciple, and it's the love that you have for one another. And in other places, he makes clear it's our love for every single human being we meet, with no exceptions, none, no exceptions. So the commandment, the Maunday Thursday commandment, the new commandment, is to love one another. As simple as that. That's how people will know that you belong to Jesus Christ. Not by your theology, not by your church attendance, not not by your morality, not by your stand on social issues. They're going to know it by your love, by the love that you have first and foremost for those closest to you, for those in your community of faith, but also your love for every person you meet. So 3 things. He washes their feet. We should be serving one another. He teaches us how to grow in love by remaining attached to the vine, and Jesus Christ is that vine. And then he tells us that when we're attached to him, his love flows through us like the sap in a tree and remakes us from within, so that we can live into his commandment, his new commandment, that we would love one another.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble.